In the bushes in plain view, necking madly before the 1 o'clock curfew, so everybody passing by could see them. A million years of evolution, Eric said bitterly, and what are we? Animals. Then Eric told me how he had slept with his first woman. He went to a southern prep school that specialized in building all-round gentlemen, and by the time you graduated it was an unwritten rule that you had to have known a woman. Known in the biblical sense, Eric said. So one Saturday Eric and a few of his classmates took a bus into the nearest city and visited a notorious whorehouse. Eric's whore hadn't even taken off her dress. She was a fat, middle-aged woman with dyed red hair and suspiciously thick lips and rat-colored skin, and she wouldn't turn off the light, so he had her under a fly-spotted 25-watt bulb, and it was nothing like it was cracked up to be. It was boring as going to the toilet. I said maybe if you loved a woman it wouldn't seem so boring, but Eric said it would be spoiled by thinking this woman too was just an animal like the rest, so if he loved anybody he would never go to bed with her. He'd go to a whore if he had to and keep the woman he loved free of all that dirty business. It had crossed my mind at the time that Eric might be a good person to go to bed with, since he had already done it and, unlike the usual run of boys, didn't seem dirty-minded or silly when he talked about it. But then Eric wrote me a letter saying he thought he might really be able to love me. I was so intelligent and cynical and yet had such a kind face, surprisingly like his older sister's, so I knew it was no use. I was the type he would never go to bed with, and wrote him I was unfortunately about to marry a childhood sweetheart. The more I thought about it the better I liked the idea of being seduced by a simultaneous interpreter in New York City. Constantine seemed mature and considerate in every way. There were no people I knew he would want to brag to about it, the way college boys bragged about sleeping with girls in the backs of cars to their roommates or their friends on the basketball team. And there would be a pleasant irony in sleeping with a man Mrs. Willard had introduced me to, as if she were, in a roundabout way, to blame for it. When Constantine asked if I would like to come up to his apartment to hear some balalaika records, I smiled to myself. My mother had always told me never under any circumstances to go with a man to a man's rooms after an evening out. It could mean only one thing. I am very fond of balalaika music, I said. Constantine's room had a balcony, and the balcony overlooked the river, and we could hear the hooing of the tugs down in the darkness. I felt moved. And tender and perfectly certain about what I was going to do. I knew I might have a baby, but that thought hung far and dim in the distance and didn't trouble me at all. There was no 100% sure way not to have a baby, it said in an article my mother cut out of the Reader's Digest and mailed to me at college. This article was written by a married woman lawyer with children and called In Defense of Chastity. It gave all the reasons a girl shouldn't sleep with anybody but her husband, and then only after they were married. The main point of the article was that a man's world is different from a woman's world, and a man's emotions are different from a woman's emotions, and only marriage can bring the two worlds and the two different sets of emotions together properly. My mother said this was something a girl didn't know about till it was too late, so she had to take the advice of people who were already experts, like a married woman. This woman lawyer said the best men wanted to be pure for their wives, and even if they weren't pure, they wanted to be the ones to teach their wives about sex. Of course they would try to persuade a girl to have sex and say they would marry her later, but as soon as she gave in, they would lose all respect for her and start saying that if she did that with them she would do that with other men, and they would end up by making her life miserable. The woman finished her article by saying better be safe than sorry, and besides, there was no sure way of not getting stuck with a baby, and then you'd really be in a pickle. Now the one thing this article didn't seem to me to consider was how a girl felt. It might be nice to be pure and then to marry a pure man, but what if he suddenly confessed he wasn't pure after we were married, the way Buddy Willard had? I couldn't stand the idea of a woman having to have a single pure life and a man being able to have a double life, one pure and one not. Finally, I decided that if it was so difficult to find a red-blooded intelligent man who was still pure by the time he was 21, I might as well forget about staying pure myself and marry somebody who wasn't pure either. Then when he started to make my life miserable, I could make his miserable as well. When I was 19, pureness was the great issue. Instead of the world being divided up into Catholics and Protestants or Republicans and Democrats or white men and black men or even men and women, I saw the world divided into people who had slept with somebody and people who hadn't, and this seemed the only really significant difference between one person and another. I thought a spectacular change would come over me the day I crossed the boundary line. I thought it would be the way I'd feel if I ever visited Europe. I'd come home, and if I looked closely into the mirror I'd be able to make out a little white Alp at the back of my eye. Now I thought that if I looked into the mirror tomorrow I'd see a doll-sized Constantine sitting in my eye and smiling out at me. Well, for about an hour we lounged on Constantine's balcony in two separate slingback chairs with the Victrola playing and the balalaika records stacked between us. A faint milky light diffused from the street lights or the half-moon or the cars or the stars, I couldn't tell what, but apart from holding my hand Constantine showed no desire to seduce me whatsoever. I asked if he was engaged or had any special girlfriend, thinking maybe that's what was the matter, but he said no. He made a point of keeping clear of such attachments. At last I felt a powerful drowsiness drifting through my veins from all the pine bark wine I had drunk. "I think I'll go in and lie down," I said. I strolled casually into the bedroom and stooped over to nudge off my shoes. The clean bed bobbed before me like a safe boat. I stretched full length and shut my eyes. Then I heard Constantine sigh and come in from the balcony. One by one his shoes clonked onto the floor, and he lay down by my side. I looked at him secretly from under a fall of hair. He was lying on his back, his hands under his head, staring at the ceiling. The starched white sleeves of his shirt, rolled up to the elbows, glimmered eerily in the half-dark and his tanned skin seemed almost black. I thought he must be the most beautiful man I'd ever seen. I thought if only I had a keen, shapely bone structure to my face or could discuss politics shrewdly or was a famous writer Constantine might find me interesting enough to sleep with. And then I wondered if as soon as he came to like me he would sink into ordinariness, and if as soon as he came to love me I would find fault after fault, the way I did with Buddy Willard and the boys before him. The same thing happened over and over. I would catch sight of some flawless man off in the distance, but as soon as he moved closer I immediately saw he wouldn't do it all. That's one of the reasons I never wanted to get married. The last thing I wanted was infinite security and to be the place an arrow shoots off from. I wanted change and excitement and to shoot off in all directions myself, like the colored arrows from a 4th of July rocket. I woke to the sound of rain. It was pitch dark. After a while I deciphered the faint outlines of an unfamiliar window. Every so often a beam of light appeared out of thin air, traversed the wall like a ghostly, exploratory finger, and slid off into nothing again. Then I heard the sound of somebody breathing. At first I thought it was only myself, and that I was lying in the dark in my hotel room after being poisoned. I held my breath, but the breathing kept on. A green eye glowed on the bed beside me. It was divided into quarters like a compass. I reached out slowly and dosed my hand on it. I lifted it up. With it came an arm, heavy as a dead man's, but warm with sleep. Constantine's watch said 3 o'clock. He was lying in his shirt and trousers and stocking feet just as I had left him when I dropped asleep, and as my eyes grew used to the darkness I made out his pale eyelids and his straight nose and his tolerant, shapely mouth, but they seemed insubstantial, as if drawn on fog. For a few minutes I leaned over, studying him. I had never fallen asleep beside a man before. I tried to imagine what it would be like if Constantine were my husband. It would mean getting up at 7 and cooking him eggs and bacon and toast and coffee and dawdling about in my nightgown and curlers after he'd left for work to wash up the dirty plates and make the bed, and then when he came home after a lively, fascinating day he'd expect a big dinner, and I'd spend the evening washing up even more dirty plates till I fell into bed, utterly exhausted. This seemed a dreary and wasted life for a girl with 15 years of straight A's, but I knew that's what marriage was like, because cook and clean and wash was just what Buddy Willard's mother did from morning till night, and she was the wife of a university professor and had been a private school teacher herself. Once when I visited Buddy, I found Mrs. Willard braiding a rug out of strips of wool from Mr. Willard's old suits. She'd spent weeks on that rug, and I had admired the tweedy browns and greens and blues patterning the braid, but after Mrs. Willard was through, instead of hanging the rug on the wall the way I would have done, she put it down in place of her kitchen mat, and in a few days it was soiled and dull and indistinguishable from any mat you could buy for under $1 in the 5 and 10. And I knew that in spite of all the roses and kisses and restaurant dinners a man showered on a woman before he married her, what he secretly wanted when the wedding service ended was for her to flatten out underneath his feet like Mrs. Willard's kitchen mat. Hadn't my own mother told me that as soon as she and my father left Reno on their honeymoon, my father had been married before, so he needed a divorce. My father said to her, "Phew, that's a relief, now we can stop pretending and be ourselves." And from that day on my mother never had a minute's peace. I also remembered Buddy Willard saying in a sinister, knowing way that after I had children I would feel differently, I wouldn't want to write poems anymore. So I began to think maybe it was true that when you were married and had children it was like being brainwashed, and afterward you went about numb as a slave in some private, totalitarian state. As I stared down at Constantine the way you stare down at a bright, unattainable pebble at the bottom of a deep well, his eyelids lifted and he looked through me, and his eyes were full of love. I watched dumbly as a shudder of recognition clicked across the blur of tenderness and the wide pupils went glossy and depthless as patent leather. Constantine sat up, yawning. "What time is it?" "3, I said in a flat voice. "I better go home. I have to be at work first thing in the morning." "I'll drive you." As we sat back to back on our separate sides of the bed fumbling with our shoes in the horrid cheerful white light of the bed lamp, I sensed Constantine turn round. "Is your hair always like that?" "Like what?" He didn't answer but reached over and put his hand at the root of my hair and ran his fingers out slowly to the tip ends like a comb. A little electric shock flared through me and I sat quite still. Ever since I was small I loved feeling somebody comb my hair. It made me go all sleepy and peaceful. "Ah, I know what it is," Constantine said. "You've just washed it." And he bent to lace up his tennis shoes. An hour later I lay in my hotel bed, listening to the rain. It didn't even sound like rain, it sounded like a tap running. The ache in the middle of my left shin bone came to life, and I abandoned any hope of sleep before 7, when my radio alarm clock would rouse me with its hearty renderings of Sousa. Every time it rained the old leg break seemed to remember itself, and what it remembered was a dull hurt. Then I thought, Buddy Willard made me break that leg. Then I thought, no, I broke it myself. I broke it on purpose to pay myself back for being such a heel. 8. Marva Willard drove me up to the Adirondacks. It was the day after Christmas and a gray sky bellied over us, fat with snow. I felt overstuffed and dull and disappointed, the way I always do the day after Christmas, as if whatever it was the pine boughs and the candles and the silver and gilt ribbon presents and the birch log fires and the Christmas turkey and the carols and the piano promised never came to pass. At Christmas I almost wished I was a Catholic. First Mr. Willard drove and then I drove. I don't know what we talked about, but as the countryside, already deep under old falls of snow, turned us a bleaker shoulder, and as the fir trees crowded down from the gray hills to the road edge, so darkly green they looked black, I grew gloomier and gloomier. I was tempted to tell Mr. Willard to go ahead alone, I would hitchhike home. But one glance at Mr. Willard's face, the silver hair in its boyish crewcut, the clear blue eyes, the pink cheeks, all frosted like a sweet wedding cake with the innocent, trusting expression, and I knew I couldn't do it. I'd have to see the visit through to the end. At midday the grayness paled a bit, and we parked in an icy turnoff and shared out the tuna fish sandwiches and the oatmeal cookies and the apples and the thermos of black coffee Mrs. Willard had packed for our lunch. Mr. Willard eyed me kindly. Then he cleared his throat and brushed a few last crumbs from his lap. I could tell he was going to say something serious, because he was very shy, and I'd heard him clear his throat in that same way before giving an important economics lecture. Nellie and I have always wanted a daughter. For one crazy minute I thought Mr. Willard was going to announce that Mrs. Willard was pregnant and expecting a baby girl. Then he said, "But I don't see how any daughter could be nicer than you." Mr. Willard must have thought I was crying because I was so glad he wanted to be a father to me. There, he patted my shoulder and cleared his throat once or twice. "I think we understand each other." Then he opened the car door on his side and strolled round to my side, his breath shaping tortuous smoke signals in the gray air. I moved over to the seat he had left and he started the car and we drove on. I'm not sure what I expected of Buddy's sanatorium. I think I expected a kind of wooden chalet perched up on top of a small mountain, with rosy-cheeked young men and women, all very attractive but with hectic glittering eyes, lying covered with thick blankets on outdoor balconies. TB is like living with a bomb in your lung, Buddy had written to me at college. You just lie around very quietly hoping it won't go off. I found it hard to imagine Buddy lying quietly. His whole philosophy of life was to be up and doing every second. Even when we went to the beach in the summer, he never lay down to drowse in the sun the way I did. He ran back and forth or played ball or did a little series of rapid push-ups to use the time. Mr. Willard and I waited in the reception room for the end of the afternoon rest cure. The color scheme of the whole sanatorium seemed to be based on liver. Dark, glowering woodwork, burnt brown leather chairs, walls that might once have been white but had succumbed under a spreading malady of mold or damp. A mottled brown linoleum sealed off the floor. On a low coffee table, with circular and semicircular stains bitten into the dark veneer, lay a few wilted numbers of Time and Life. I flipped to the middle of the nearest magazine. The face of Eisenhower beamed up at me, bald and blank as the face of a fetus in a bottle. After a while I became aware of a sly, leaking noise. For a minute I thought the walls had begun to discharge the moisture that must saturate them, but then I saw the noise came from a small fountain in one corner of the room. The fountain spurted a few inches into the air from a rough length of pipe, threw up its hands, collapsed and drowned its ragged dribble in a stone basin of yellowing water. The basin was paved with the white hexagonal tiles one finds in public lavatories. A buzzer sounded. Doors opened and shut in the distance. Then Buddy came in. "Hello, Dad." Buddy hugged his father, and promptly, with a dreadful brightness, came over to me and held out his hand. I shook it. It felt moist and fat. Mr. Willard and I sat together on a leather couch. Buddy perched opposite us on the edge of a slippery armchair. He kept smiling, as if the corners of his mouth were strung up on invisible wire. The last thing I expected was for Buddy to be fat. All the time I thought of him at the sanatorium I saw shadows carving themselves under his cheekbones and his eyes burning out of almost fleshless sockets. But everything concave about Buddy had suddenly turned convex. A pot belly swelled under the tight white nylon shirt and his cheeks were round and ruddy as marzipan fruit. Even his laugh sounded plump. Buddy's eyes met mine. "It's the eating," he said. "They stuff us day after day and then just make us lie around. But I'm allowed out on walk hours now, so don't worry, I'll thin down in a couple of weeks." He jumped up, smiling like a glad host. "Would you like to see my room?" I followed Buddy, and Mr. Willard followed me, through a pair of swinging doors set with panes of frosted glass down a dim, liver-colored corridor smelling of floor wax and Lysol and another vaguer odor, like bruised gardenias. Buddy threw open a brown door, and we filed into the narrow room. A lumpy bed, shrouded by a thin white spread, pencil-striped with blue, took up most of the space. Next to it stood a bed table with a pitcher and a water glass and the silver twig of a thermometer poking out from a jar of pink disinfectant. A second table, covered with books and papers and off-kilter clay pots baked and painted, but not glazed, squeezed itself between the bed foot and the closet door. "Well," Mr. Willard breathed, it looks comfortable enough. Buddy laughed. What are these? I picked up a clay ashtray in the shape of a lily pad, with the veinings carefully drawn in yellow on a murky green ground. Buddy didn't smoke. That's an ashtray, Buddy said. It's for you. I put the tray down. I don't smoke. I know, Buddy said. I thought you might like it, though. Well, Mr. Willard rubbed one papery lip against another. I guess I'll be getting on. I guess I'll be leaving you two young people. Fine, Dad. You be getting on. I was surprised. I had thought Mr. Willard was going to stay the night, before driving me back the next day. Shall I come too? No, no. Mr. Willard peeled a few bills from his wallet and handed them to Buddy. See that Esther gets a comfortable seat on the train. She'll stay a day or so, maybe. Buddy escorted his father to the door. I felt Mr. Willard had deserted me. I thought he must have planned it all along, but Buddy said no, his father simply couldn't stand the sight of sickness, and especially his own son's sickness, because he thought all sickness was sickness of the will. Mr. Willard had never been sick a day in his life. I sat down on Buddy's bed. There simply wasn't anywhere else to sit. Buddy rummaged among his papers in a businesslike way. Then he handed me a thin, gray magazine. Turn to page 11. The magazine was printed somewhere in Maine and full of stenciled poems and descriptive paragraphs separated from each other by asterisks. On page 11 I found a poem titled Florida Dawn. I skipped down through image after image about watermelon lights and turtle green palms and shells fluted like bits of Greek architecture. Not bad. I thought it was dreadful. Who wrote it? Buddy asked with an odd, pigeony smile. My eye dropped to the name on the lower right-hand corner of the page. B. S. Willard. I don't know. Then I said, of course I know, Buddy. You wrote it. Buddy edged over to me. I edged back. I have very little knowledge about TB, but it seemed to me an extremely sinister disease, the way it went on so invisibly. I thought Buddy might well be sitting in his own little murderous aura of TB germs. Don't worry, Buddy cooed. I'm not positive. Positive? You can't catch anything. Buddy stopped for a breath, the way you do in the middle of climbing something very steep. I want to ask you a question. He had a disquieting new habit of boring into my eyes with his look as if actually bent on piercing my head, the better to analyze what went on inside it. I'd thought of asking it by letter. I had a fleeting vision of a pale blue envelope with a Yale crest on the back flap. But then I decided it would be better if I waited until you came up, so I could ask you in person. He paused. Well, don't you want to know what it is? What? I said in a small, unpromising voice. Buddy sat down beside me. He put his arm around my waist and brushed the hair from my ear. I didn't move. Then I heard him whisper, "How would you like to be Mrs. Buddy Willard?" I had an awful impulse to laugh. I thought how that question would have bowled me over at any time in my 5 or 6 year period of adoring Buddy Willard from a distance. Buddy saw me hesitate. "Oh, I'm in no shape now, I know," he said quickly. "I'm still on PAS and I may yet lose a rib or two, but I'll be back at med school by next fall. A year from this spring at the latest. I think I should tell you something, Buddy." "I know," Buddy said stiffly. "You've met someone." "No, it's not that." "What is it, then?" "I'm never going to get married." "You're crazy." Buddy brightened. "You'll change your mind." "No. My mind's made up." But Buddy just went on looking cheerful. "Remember," I said, "that time you hitchhiked back to college with me? After skit night?" "I remember. Remember how you asked me where would I like to live best, the country or the city? And you said? And I said I wanted to live in the country and in the city both? Buddy nodded. And you, I continued with sudden force, laughed and said I had the perfect setup of a true neurotic and that question came from some questionnaire you'd had in psychology class that week? Buddy's smile dimmed. Well, you were right. I am neurotic. I could never settle down in either the country or the city. You could live between them, Buddy suggested helpfully. Then you could go to the city sometimes and to the country sometimes. Well, what's so neurotic about that? Buddy didn't answer. Well, I rapped out, thinking, you can't coddle these sick people. It's the worst thing for them, it'll spoil them to bits. Nothing, Buddy said in a pale, still voice. Neurotic, ha! I let out a scornful laugh. If neurotic is wanting two mutually exclusive things at one and the same time, then I'm neurotic as hell. I'll be flying back and forth between one mutually exclusive thing and another for the rest of my days. Buddy put his hand on mine. Let me fly with you. I stood at the top of a ski slope on Mount Pisgah, looking down. I had no business to be up there. I had never skied before in my life. Still, I thought I would enjoy the view while I had the chance. At my left, the rope-tow deposited skier after skier on the snowy summit which, packed by much crossing and recrossing and slightly melted in the noon sun, had hardened to the consistency and polish of glass. The cold air punished my lungs and sinuses to a visionary clearness. On every side of me the red and blue and white jacketed skiers tore away down the blinding slope like fugitive bits of an American flag. From the foot of the ski run, the imitation log cabin lodge piped its popular songs into the overhang of silence. Gazing down on the Jungfrau. From our chalet for two. The lilt and boom threaded by me like an invisible rivulet in a desert of snow. One careless, superb gesture, and I would be hurled into motion down the slope toward the small khaki spot in the sidelines, among the spectators, which was Buddy Willard. All morning Buddy had been teaching me how to ski. First, Buddy borrowed skis and ski poles from a friend of his in the village, and ski boots from a doctor's wife whose feet were only one size larger than my own, and a red ski jacket from a student nurse. His persistence in the face of mulishness was astounding. Then I remembered that at medical school Buddy had won a prize for persuading the most relatives of dead people to have their dead ones cut up whether they needed it or not, in the interests of science. I forget what the prize was, but I could just see Buddy in his white coat with his stethoscope sticking out of a side pocket like part of his anatomy, smiling and bowing and talking those dumb relatives into signing the post-mortem papers. Next, Buddy borrowed a car from his own doctor, who'd had TB himself and was very understanding, and we drove off as the buzzer for walk hour rasped along the sunless sanatorium corridors. Buddy had never skied before either, but he said that the elementary principles were quite simple, and as he'd often watched the ski instructors and their pupils he could teach me all I'd need to know. For the first half hour I obediently herringboned up a small slope, pushed off with my poles and coasted straight down. Buddy seemed pleased with my progress. That's fine, Esther, he observed, as I negotiated my slope for the 20th time. Now let's try you on the rope tow. I stopped in my tracks, flushed and panting. But Buddy, I don't know how to zigzag yet. All those people coming down from the top know how to zigzag. Oh, you need only go halfway. Then you won't gain very much momentum. And Buddy accompanied me to the rope tow and showed me how to let the rope run through my hands, and then told me to close my fingers round it and go up. It never occurred to me to say no. I wrapped my fingers around the rough, bruising snake of a rope that slithered through them, and went up. But the rope dragged me, wobbling and balancing, so rapidly I couldn't hope to dissociate myself from it halfway. There was a skier in front of me and a skier behind me, and I'd have been knocked over and stuck full of skis and poles the minute I let go, and I didn't want to make trouble, so I hung quietly on. At the top, though, I had second thoughts. Buddy singled me out, hesitating there in the red jacket. His arms chopped the air like khaki windmills. Then I saw he was signaling me to come down a path that had opened in the middle of the weaving skiers. But as I poised, uneasy, with a dry throat, the smooth white path from my feet to his feet blurred. A skier crossed it from the left, another crossed it from the right, and Buddy's arms went on waving feebly as antennae from the other side of a field swarming with tiny moving animalcules like germs, or bent, bright exclamation marks. I looked up from that churning amphitheater to the view beyond it. The great, gray eye of the sky looked back at me, its mist-shrouded sun focusing all the white and silent distances that poured from every point of the compass, hill after pale hill, to stall at my feet. The interior voice nagging me not to be a fool to save my skin and take off my skis and walk down, camouflaged by the scrub pines bordering the slope, fled like a disconsolate mosquito. The thought that I might kill myself formed in my mind coolly as a tree or a flower. I measured the distance to Buddy with my eye. His arms were folded, now, and he seemed of a piece with the split-rail fence behind him, numb, brown, and inconsequential. Edging to the rim of the hilltop, I dug the spikes of my poles into the snow and pushed myself into a flight I knew I couldn't stop by skill or any belated access of will. I aimed straight down. A keen wind that had been hiding itself struck me full in the mouth and raked the hair back horizontal on my head. I was descending, but the white sun rose no higher. It hung over the suspended waves of the hills, an insentient pivot without which the world would not exist. A small, answering point in my own body flew toward it. I felt my lungs inflate with the inrush of scenery, air, mountains, trees, people. I thought, this is what it is to be happy. I plummeted down past the zigzaggers, the students, the experts, through year after year of doubleness and smiles and compromise, into my own. Past. People and trees receded on either hand like the dark sides of a tunnel. As I hurtled onto the still, bright point at the end of it, the pebble at the bottom of the well, the white sweet baby cradled in its mother's belly. My teeth crunched a gravelly mouthful. Ice water seeped down my throat. Buddy's face hung over me, near and huge, like a distracted planet. Other faces showed themselves up and back of his. Behind him, black dots swarmed on a plain of whiteness. Piece by piece, as at the strokes of a dull godmother's wand, the old world sprang back into position. "You are doing fine," a familiar voice informed my ear, "until that man stepped into your path." People were unfastening my bindings and collecting my ski poles from where they poked skyward, askew, in their separate snowbanks. The lodge fence propped itself at my back. Buddy bent to pull off my boots and the several pairs of white wool socks that padded them. His plump hand shut on my left foot, then inched up my ankle, closing and probing, as if feeling for a concealed weapon. A dispassionate white sun shone at the summit of the sky. I wanted to hone myself on it till I grew saintly and thin and essential as the blade of a knife. "I'm going up," I said. "I'm going to do it again." "No, you're not." A queer, satisfied expression came over Buddy's face. "No, you're not," he repeated with a final smile. "Your leg's broken. In 2 places. You'll be stuck in a cast for months." 9. "I'm so glad they're going to die." Hilda arched her cat limbs in a yawn, buried her head in her arms on the conference table and went back to sleep. A wisp of bilious green straw perched on her brow like a tropical bird. Bile green. They were promoting it for fall, only Hilda, as usual, was half a year ahead of time. Bile green with black, bile green with white, bile green with Nile green, its kissing cousin. Fashion blurbs, silver and full of nothing, sent up their fishy bubbles in my brain. They surfaced with a hollow pop. "I'm so glad they're going to die." I cursed the luck that had timed my arrival in the hotel cafeteria to coincide with Hilda's. After a late night, I felt too dull to think up the excuse that would take me back to my room for the glove, the handkerchief, the umbrella, the notebook I forgot. My penalty was the long, dead walk from the frosted glass doors of the Amazon to the strawberry marble slab of our entry on Madison Avenue. Hilda moved like a mannequin the whole way. "That's a lovely hat, did you make it?" I half expected Hilda to turn on me and say, "You sound sick," but she only extended and then retracted her swanny neck. "Yes." The night before I'd seen a play where the heroine was possessed by a Dybbuk, and when the Dybbuk spoke from her mouth its voice sounded so cavernous and deep you couldn't tell whether it was a man or a woman. Well, Hilda's voice sounded just like the voice of that Dybbuk. She stared at her reflection in the glossed shop windows as if to make sure, moment by moment, that she continued to exist. The silence between us was so profound I thought part of it must be my fault. So I said, "Isn't it awful about the Rosenbergs?" The Rosenbergs were to be electrocuted late that night. "Yes," Hilda said, and at last I felt I had touched a human string in the cat's cradle of her heart. It was only as the two of us waited for the others in the tomb-like morning gloom of the conference room that Hilda amplified that yes of hers. "It's awful such people should be alive." She yawned then, and her pale orange mouth opened on a large darkness. Fascinated, I stared at the blind cave behind her face until the two lips met and moved and the Dybbuk spoke out of its hiding place, "I'm so glad they're going to die. Come on, give us a smile." I sat on the pink velvet love seat in JC's office, holding a paper rose and facing the magazine photographer. I was the last of the 12 to have my picture taken. I had tried concealing myself in the powder room, but it didn't work. Betsy had spied my feet under the doors. I didn't want my picture taken because I was going to cry. I didn't know why I was going to cry, but I knew that if anybody spoke to me or looked at me too closely the tears would fly out of my eyes and the sobs would fly out of my throat and I'd cry for a week. I could feel the tears brimming and sloshing in me like water in a glass that is unsteady and too full. This was the last round of photographs before the magazine went to press and we returned to Tulsa or Biloxi or Teaneck or Coos Bay or wherever we'd come from, and we were supposed to be photographed with props to show what we wanted to be. Betsy held an ear of corn to show she wanted to be a farmer's wife, and Hilda held the bald, faceless head of a hat maker's dummy to show she wanted to design hats, and Doreen held a gold-embroidered sari to show she wanted to be a social worker in India. She didn't really, she told me, she only wanted to get her hands on a sari. When they asked me what I wanted to be I said I didn't know. "Oh, sure you know," the photographer said. "She wants," said JC wittily, "to be everything." I said I wanted to be a poet. Then they scouted about for something for me to hold. JC suggested a book of poems, but the photographer said no, that was too obvious. It should be something that showed what inspired the poems. Finally JC undipped the single, long-stemmed paper rose from her latest hat. The photographer fiddled with his hot white lights. "Show us how happy it makes you to write a poem." I stared through the frieze of rubber plant leaves in JC's window to the blue sky beyond. A few stagey cloud puffs were traveling from right to left. I fixed my eyes on the largest cloud, as if, when it passed out of sight, I might have the good luck to pass with it. I felt it was very important to keep the line of my mouth level. "Give us a smile." At last, obediently, like the mouth of a ventriloquist's dummy, my own mouth started to cork up. "Hey," the photographer protested, with sudden foreboding, "you look like you're going to cry." I couldn't stop. I buried my face in the pink velvet facade of JC's love seat and with immense relief the salt tears and miserable noises that had been prowling around in me all morning burst out into the room. When I lifted my head, the photographer had vanished. JC had vanished as well. I felt limp and betrayed, like the skin shed by a terrible animal. It was a relief to be free of the animal, but it seemed to have taken my spirit with it, and everything else it could lay its paws on. I fumbled in my pocketbook for the Guilt Compact with the mascara and the mascara brush and the eyeshadow and the 3 lipsticks and the side mirror. The face that peered back at me seemed to be peering from the grating of a prison cell after a prolonged beating. It looked bruised and puffy and all the wrong colors. It was a face that needed soap and water and Christian tolerance. I started to paint it with small heart. JC breezed back after a decent interval with an armful of manuscripts. These amuse you, she said. Have a good read. Every morning a snowy avalanche of manuscripts swelled the dust-gray piles in the office of the fiction editor. Secretly, in studies and attics and schoolrooms all over America, people must be writing. Say someone or other finished a manuscript every minute. In 5 minutes that would be 5 manuscripts stacked on the fiction editor's desk. Within the hour there would be 60, crowding each other onto the floor. And in a year. I smiled, seeing a pristine, imaginary manuscript floating in midair, with Esther Greenwood typed in the upper right-hand corner. After my month on the magazine, I'd applied for a summer school course with a famous writer where you sent in the manuscript of a story and he read it and said whether you were good enough to be admitted into his class. Of course, it was a very small class, and I had sent in my story a long time ago and hadn't heard from the writer yet, but I was sure I'd find a letter of acceptance waiting on the mail table at home. I decided I'd surprise JC and send in a couple of the stories I wrote in this class under a pseudonym. Then one day the fiction editor would come into JC personally and plop the stories down on her desk and say, "Here's something a cut above the usual," and JC would agree and accept them and ask the author to lunch, and it would be me. Honestly, Doreen said, "This one will be different." "Tell me about him," I said stonily. "He's from Peru." "They're squat," I said. "They're ugly as Aztecs." No, sweetie. I've already met him." We were sitting on my bed in a mess of dirty cotton dresses and laddered nylons and gray underwear, and for 10 minutes Doreen had been trying to persuade me to go to a country club dance with a friend of somebody Lenny knew, which, she insisted, was a very different thing from a friend of Lenny's. But as I was catching the 8 o'clock train home the next morning, I felt I should make some attempt to pack. I also had a dim idea that if I walked the streets of New York by myself all night, something of the city's mystery and magnificence might rub off onto me at last. But I gave it up. It was becoming more and more difficult for me to decide to do anything in those last days. And when I eventually did decide to do something, such as packing a suitcase, I only dragged all my grubby, expensive clothes out of the bureau and the closet and spread them on the chairs and the bed and the floor and then sat and stared at them, utterly perplexed. They seemed to have a separate, mulish identity of their own that refused to be washed and folded and stowed. "It's these clothes," I told Doreen. "I just can't face these clothes when I come back." "That's easy." And in her beautiful, one-track way, Doreen started to snatch up slips and stockings and the elaborate strapless bra, full of steel springs, a free gift from the Primrose Corset Company, which I'd never had the courage to wear, and finally, one by one, the sad array of queerly cut $40 dresses. "Hey, leave that one out. I'm wearing it." Doreen extricated a black scrap from her bundle and dropped it in my lap. Then, snowballing the rest of the clothes into one soft, conglomerate mass, she stuffed them out of sight under the bed. Doreen knocked on the green door with the gold knob. Scuffing and a man's laugh, cut short, sounded from inside. Then a tall boy in shirt sleeves and a blonde crew cut inched the door open and peered out. "Baby," he roared. Doreen disappeared in his arms. I thought it must be the person Lenny knew. I stood quietly in the doorway in my black sheath and my black stole with the fringe, yellower than ever, but expecting less. I am an observer, I told myself, as I watched Doreen being handed into the room by the blonde boy to another man, who was also tall, but dark, with slightly longer hair. This man was wearing an immaculate white suit, a pale blue shirt and a yellow satin tie with a bright stickpin. I couldn't take my eyes off that stickpin. A great white light seemed to shoot out of it, illuminating the room. Then the light withdrew into itself, leaving a dewdrop on a field of gold. I put one foot in front of the other. "That's a diamond," somebody said, and a lot of people burst out laughing. My nail tapped a glassy facet. Her first diamond. Give it to her, Marco. Marco bowed and deposited the stick pin in my palm. It dazzled and danced with light like a heavenly ice cube. I slipped it quickly into my imitation jet bead evening bag and looked around. The faces were empty as plates, and nobody seemed to be breathing. Fortunately, a dry, hard hand encircled my upper arm. I am escorting the lady for the rest of the evening. Perhaps, the spark in Marco's eyes extinguished, and they went black. I shall perform some small service. Somebody laughed. That worthy of a diamond. The hand round my arm tightened. Ouch! Marco removed his hand. I looked down at my arm. A thumbprint purpled into view. Marco watched me. Then he pointed to the underside of my arm. Look there. I looked, and saw 4 faint matching prints. You see, I am quite serious. Marco's small, flickering smile reminded me of a snake I'd teased in the Bronx Zoo. When I tapped my finger on the stout cage glass, the snake had opened its clockwork jaws and seemed to smile. Then it struck and struck and struck at the invisible pain till I moved off. I had never met a woman hater before. I could tell Marco was a woman hater, because in spite of all the models and TV starlets in the room that night, he paid attention to nobody but me. Not out of kindness or even curiosity, but because I'd happened to be dealt to him, like a playing card in a pack of identical cards. A man in the country club band stepped up to the mic and started shaking those seed pod rattles that mean South American music. Marco reached for my hand, but I hung on to my 4th daiquiri and stayed put. I'd never had a daiquiri before. The reason I had a daiquiri was because Marco ordered it for me, and I felt so grateful he hadn't asked what sort of drink I wanted that I didn't say a word. I just drank one daiquiri after another. Marco looked at me. No, I said. What do you mean, no? I can't dance to that kind of music. Don't be stupid. I want to sit here and finish my drink. Marco bent toward me with a tight smile, and in one swoop my drink took wing and landed in a potted palm. Then Marco gripped my hand in such a way I had to choose between following him onto the floor or having my arm torn off. It's a tango. Marco maneuvered me out among the dancers. I love tangos. I can't dance. You don't have to dance. I'll do the dancing. Marco hooked an arm around my waist and jerked me up against his dazzling white suit. Then he said, "Pretend you are drowning." I shut my eyes, and the music broke over me like a rainstorm. Marco's leg slid forward against mine and my leg slid back, and I seemed to be riveted to him, limb for limb, moving as he moved, without any will or knowledge of my own, and after a while I thought, it doesn't take 2 to dance, it only takes 1, and I let myself blow and bend like a tree in the wind. What did I tell you? Marco's breath scorched my ear. You're a perfectly respectable dancer. I began to see why woman haters could make such fools of women. Woman haters were like gods, invulnerable and chock full of power. They descended, and then they disappeared. You could never catch one. After the South American music there was an interval. Marco led me through the French doors into the garden. Lights and voices spilled from the ballroom window, but a few yards beyond the darkness drew up its barricade and sealed them off. In the infinitesimal glow of the stars, the trees and flowers were strewing their cool odors. There was no moon. The box hedges shut behind us. A deserted golf course stretched away toward a few hilly clumps of trees, and I felt the whole desolate familiarity of the scene, the country club and the dance and the lawn with its single cricket. I didn't know where I was, but it was somewhere in the wealthy suburbs of New York. Marco produced a slim cigar and a silver lighter in the shape of a bullet. He set the cigar between his lips and bent over the small flare. His face, with its exaggerated shadows and planes of light, looked alien and pained, like a refugee's. I watched him. Who are you in love with? I said then. For a minute Marco didn't say anything, he simply opened his mouth and breathed out a blue, vaporous ring. Perfect, he laughed. The ring widened and blurred, ghost pale on the dark air. Then he said, I am in love with my cousin. I felt no surprise. Why don't you marry her? Impossible. Why? Marco shrugged. She's my first cousin. She's going to be a nun. Is she beautiful? There's no one to touch her. Does she know you love her? Of course. I paused. The obstacle seemed unreal to me. If you love her, I said, you'll love somebody else someday. Marco dashed his cigar underfoot. The ground soared and struck me with a soft shock. Mud squirmed through my fingers. Marco waited until I half rose. Then he put both hands on my shoulders and flung me back. My dress. Your dress. The mud oozed and adjusted itself to my shoulder blades. Your dress. Marco's face lowered cloudily over mine. A few drops of spit struck my lips. Your dress is black and the dirt is black as well. Then he threw himself face down as if he would grind his body through me and into the mud. It's happening, I thought. It's happening. If I just lie here and do nothing it will happen. Marco set his teeth to the strap at my shoulder and tore my sheath to the waist. I saw the glimmer of bare skin, like a pale veil separating two bloody-minded adversaries. Slut. The words hissed by my ear. Slut. The dust cleared, and I had a full view of the battle. I began to writhe and bite. Marco weighed me to the earth. Slut. I gouged at his leg with the sharp heel of my shoe. He turned, fumbling for the hurt. Then I fisted my fingers together and smashed them at his nose. It was like hitting the steel plate of a battleship. Marco sat up. I began to cry. Marco pulled out a white handkerchief and dabbed his nose. Blackness, like ink, spread over the pale cloth. I sucked at my salty knuckles. I want Doreen. Marco stared off across the golf links. I want Doreen. I want to go home. Sluts, all sluts. Marco seemed to be talking to himself. Yes or no? It is all the same. I poked Marco's shoulder. Where's Doreen? Marco snorted. Go to the parking lot. Look in the backs of all the cars. Then he spun around. My diamond. I got up and retrieved my stole from the darkness. I started to walk off. Marco sprang to his feet and blocked my path. Then, deliberately, he wiped his finger under his bloody nose and with 2 strokes stained my cheeks. I have earned my diamond with this blood. Give it to me. I don't know where it is. Now I knew perfectly well that the diamond was in my evening bag and that when Marco knocked me down my evening bag had soared, like a night bird, into the enveloping darkness. I began to think I would lead him away and then return on my own and hunt for it. I had no idea what a diamond that size would buy, but whatever it was, I knew it would be a lot. Marco took my shoulders in both hands. Tell me, he said, giving each word equal emphasis. Tell me, or I'll break your neck. Suddenly I didn't care. It's in my imitation jet bead evening bag, I said. Somewhere in the muck. I left Marco on his hands and knees, scrabbling in the darkness for another, smaller darkness that hid the light of his diamond from his furious eyes. Doreen was not in the ballroom nor in the parking lot. I kept to the fringe of the shadows so nobody would notice the grass plastered to my dress and shoes, and with my black stole I covered my shoulders and bare breasts. Luckily for me, the dance was nearly over, and groups of people were leaving and coming out to the parked cars. I asked at one car after another until finally I found a car that had room and would drop me in the middle of Manhattan. At that vague hour between dark and dawn, the sunroof of the Amazon was deserted. Quiet as a burglar in my cornflower-sprigged bathrobe, I crept to the edge of the parapet. The parapet reached almost to my shoulders, so I dragged a folding chair from the stack against the wall, opened it, and climbed onto the precarious seat. A stiff breeze lifted the hair from my head. At my feet, the city doused. Its lights in sleep, its buildings blackened, as if for a funeral. It was my last night. I grasped the bundle I carried and pulled at a pale tail. A strapless elasticized slip which, in the course of wear, had lost its elasticity, slumped into my hand. I waved it, like a flag of truce, once, twice. The breeze caught it, and I let go. A white flake floated out into the night, and began its slow descent. I wondered on what street or rooftop it would come to rest. I tugged at the bundle again. The wind made an effort, but failed, and a bat-like shadow sank toward the roof garden of the penthouse opposite. Piece by piece, I fed my wardrobe to the night wind, and flutteringly, like a loved one's ashes, the gray scraps were ferried off, to settle here, there, exactly where I would never know, in the dark heart of New York. 10. The face in the mirror looked like a sick Indian. I dropped the compact into my pocketbook and stared out of the train window. Like a colossal junkyard, the swamps and back lots of Connecticut flashed past, one broken-down fragment bearing no relation to another. What a hodgepodge the world was. I glanced down at my unfamiliar skirt and blouse. The skirt was a green dirndl with tiny black, white, and electric blue shapes swarming across it, and it stuck out like a lampshade. Instead of sleeves, the white eyelet blouse had frills at the shoulder, floppy as the wings of a new angel. I'd forgotten to save any day clothes from the ones I let fly over New York, so Betsy had traded me a blouse and skirt for my bathrobe with the cornflowers on it. A one reflection of myself, white wings, brown ponytail and all. Ghosted over the landscape. Pollyanna cowgirl, I said out loud. A woman in the seat opposite looked up from her magazine. I hadn't, at the last moment, felt like washing off the two diagonal lines of dried blood that marked my cheeks. They seemed touching, and rather spectacular, and I thought I would carry them around with me, like the relic of a dead lover, till they wore off of their own accord. Of course, if I smiled or moved my face much, the blood would flake away in no time, so I kept my face immobile, and when I had to speak I spoke. Through my teeth, without disturbing my lips. I didn't really see why people should look at me. Plenty of people looked queerer than I did. My gray suitcase rode on the rack over my head, empty except for the 30 best short stories of the year, a white plastic sunglasses case and 24 avocado pears, a parting present from Doreen. The pears were unripe, so they would keep well, and whenever I lifted my suitcase up or down or simply carried it along, they cannonied from one end to the other with a special little thunder of their own. Route 128, the conductor bawled. The domesticated wilderness of pine, maple and oak rolled to a halt and stuck in the frame of the train window like a bad picture. My suitcase grumbled and bumped as I negotiated the long aisle. I stepped from the air-conditioned compartment onto the station platform, and the motherly breath of the suburbs enfolded me. It smelt of lawn sprinklers and station wagons and tennis rackets and dogs and babies. A summer calm laid its soothing hand over everything, like death. My mother was waiting by the glove-gray Chevrolet. "Why, lovey, what's happened to your face?" "Cut myself," I said briefly, and crawled into the back seat after my suitcase. I didn't want her staring at me the whole way home. The upholstery felt slippery and clean. My mother climbed behind the wheel and tossed a few letters into my lap, then turned her back. The car purred into life. "I think I should tell you right away," she said, and I could see bad news in the set of her neck. "You didn't make that writing course." The air punched out of my stomach. All through June the writing course stretched before me like a bright, safe bridge over the dull gulf of the summer. Now I saw it totter and dissolve, and a body in a white blouse and green skirt plummet into the gap. Then my mouth shaped itself sourly. I had expected it. I slunk down on the middle of my spine, my nose level with the rim of the window, and watched the houses of outer Boston glide by. As the houses grew more familiar, I slunk still lower. I felt it was very important not to be recognized. The gray, padded car roof closed over my head like the roof of a prison van, and the white, shining, identical clapboard houses with their interstices of well-groomed green proceeded past, one bar after another in a large but escape-proof cage. I had never spent a summer in the suburbs before. The soprano squeak of carriage wheels punished my ear. Sun, seeping through the blinds, filled the bedroom with a sulphurous light. I didn't know how long I had slept, but I felt one big twitch of exhaustion. The twin bed next to mine was empty and unmade. At 7 I had heard my mother get up, slip into her clothes and tiptoe out of the room. Then the buzz of the orange squeezer sounded from downstairs, and the smell of coffee and bacon filtered under my door. Then the sink water ran from the tap and dishes clinked as my mother dried them and put them back in the cupboard. Then the front door opened and shut. Then the car door opened and shut, and the motor went broom broom and, edging off with a crunch of gravel, faded into the distance. My mother was teaching shorthand and typing to a lot of city college girls and wouldn't be home till the middle of the afternoon. The carriage wheels squeaked past again. Somebody seemed to be wheeling a baby back and forth under my window. I slipped out of bed and onto the rug, and quietly, on my hands and knees, crawled over to see who it was. Ours was a small, white clapboard house set in the middle of a small green lawn on the corner of two peaceful suburban streets, but in spite of the little maple trees planted at intervals around our property, anybody passing along the sidewalk could glance up at the second-story windows and see just what was going on. This was brought home to me by our next-door neighbor, a spiteful woman named Mrs. Ockenden. Mrs. Ockenden was a retired nurse who had just married her third husband. The other two died in curious circumstances, and she spent an inordinate amount of time peering from behind the starched white curtains of her windows. She had called my mother up twice about me, once to report that I had been sitting in front of the house for an hour under the streetlight and kissing somebody in a blue Plymouth, and once to say that I had better pull the blinds down in my room, because she had seen me half-naked getting ready for bed one night when she happened to be out walking her Scotch terrier. With great care, I raised my eyes to the level of the windowsill. A woman not 5 feet tall, with a grotesque, protruding stomach, was wheeling an old black baby carriage down the street. 2 or 3 small children of various sizes, all pale, with smudgy faces and bare smudgy knees, wobbled along in the shadow of her skirts. A serene, almost religious smile lit up the woman's face. Her head tilted happily back, like a sparrow egg perched on a duck egg, she smiled into the sun. I knew the woman well. It was Dodo Conway. Dodo Conway was a Catholic who had gone to Barnard and then married an architect who had gone to Columbia and was also a Catholic. They had a big, rambling house up the street from us, set behind a morbid facade of pine trees, and surrounded by scooters, tricycles, doll carriages, toy fire trucks, baseball bats, badminton nets, croquet wickets, hamster cages and cocker spaniel puppies, the whole sprawling paraphernalia of suburban childhood. Dodo interested me in spite of myself. Her house was unlike all the others in our neighborhood in its size. It was much bigger, in its color. The second story was constructed of dark brown clapboard and the first of gray stucco, studded with gray and purple golf ball-shaped stones, and the pine trees completely screened it from view, which was considered unsociable in our community of adjoining lawns and friendly, waist-high hedges. Dodo raised her 6 children and would no doubt raise her 7th on Rice Krispies, peanut butter and marshmallow sandwiches, vanilla ice cream and gallon upon gallon of Hood's milk. She got a special discount from the local milkman. Everybody loved Dodo, although the swelling size of her family was the talk of the neighborhood. The older people around, like my mother, had 2 children, and the younger, more prosperous ones had 4, But nobody but Dodo was on the verge of a seventh. Even 6 was considered excessive, but then, everybody said, of course Dodo was a Catholic. I watched Dodo will the youngest Conway up and down. She seemed to be doing it for my benefit. Children made me sick. A floorboard creaked, and I ducked down again, just as Dodo Conway's face, by instinct, or some gift of supernatural hearing, turned on the little pivot of its neck. I felt her gaze pierce through the white clapboard and the pink wallpaper roses and uncover me, crouching there behind the silver pickets of the radiator. I crawled back into bed and pulled the sheet over my head. But even that didn't shut out the light, so I buried my head under the darkness of the pillow and pretended it was night. I couldn't see the point of getting up. I had nothing to look forward to. After a while I heard the telephone ringing in the downstairs hall. I stuffed the pillow into my ears and gave myself 5 minutes. Then I lifted my head from its bolt hole. The ringing had stopped. Almost at once it started up again. Cursing whatever friend, relative or stranger had sniffed out my homecoming, I padded barefoot downstairs. The black instrument on the hall table trilled its hysterical note over and over, like a nervous bird. I picked up the receiver. "Hello," I said, in a low, disguised voice. "Hello, Esther, what's the matter, have you got laryngitis?" It was my old friend Jody, calling from Cambridge. Jody was working at the Coop that summer and taking a lunchtime course in sociology. She and 2 other girls from my college had rented a big apartment from 4 Harvard law students, and I'd been planning to move in with them when my writing course began. Jody wanted to know when they could expect me. "I'm not coming," I said. "I didn't make the course." There was a small pause. "He's an ass," Jody said then. "He doesn't know a good thing when he sees it." My sentiments exactly. My voice sounded strange and hollow in my ears. "Come anyway. Take some other course." The notion of studying German or abnormal psychology flitted through my head. After all, I'd saved nearly the whole of my New York salary, so I could just about afford it. But the hollow voice said, "You better count me out." "Well," Jody began, "there's this other girl who wanted to come in with us if anybody dropped out." "Fine. Ask her." The minute I hung up I knew I should have said I would come. One morning listening to Dodo Conway's baby carriage would drive me crazy. And I made a point of never living in the same house with my mother for more than a week. I reached for the receiver. My hand advanced a few inches, then retreated and fell limp. I forced it toward the receiver again, but again it stopped short, as if it had collided with a pane of glass. I wandered into the dining room. Propped on the table I found a long, businesslike letter from the summer school and a thin blue letter on leftover Yale stationery, addressed to me in Buddy Willard's lucid hand. I slit open the summer school letter with a knife. Since I wasn't accepted for the writing course, it said, I could choose some other course instead, but I should call into the admissions office that same morning, or it would be too late to register. The courses were almost full. I dialed the admissions office and listened to the zombie voice leave a message that Miss Esther Greenwood was canceling all arrangements to come to summer school. Then I opened Buddy Willard's letter. Buddy wrote that he was probably falling in love with a nurse who also had TB, but his mother had rented a cottage in the Adirondacks for the month of July, and if I came along with her, he might well find his feeling for the nurse was mere infatuation. I snatched up a pencil and crossed out Buddy's message. Then I turned the letter paper over and on the opposite side wrote that I was engaged to a simultaneous interpreter and never wanted to see Buddy again, as I did not want to give my children a hypocrite for a father. I stuck the letter back in the envelope, scotch-taped it together, and readdressed it to Buddy, without putting on a new stamp. I thought the message was worth a good 3 cents. Then I decided I would spend the summer writing a novel. That would fix a lot of people. I strolled into the kitchen, dropped a raw egg into a teacup of raw hamburger, mixed it up and ate it. Then I set up the card table on the screened breezeway between the house and the garage. A great wallowing bush of mock orange shut off the view of the street in front, the house wall and the garage wall took care of either side, and a clump of birches and a box hedge protected me from Mrs. Akinen at the back. I counted out 350 sheets of corrosible bond from my mother's stock in the hall closet, secreted away under a pile of old felt hats and clothes brushes and woolen scarves. Back on the breezeway, I fed the first, virgin sheet into my old portable and rolled it up. From another, distanced mind, I saw myself sitting on the breezeway, surrounded by two white clapboard walls, a mock orange bush and a clump of birches in a box hedge, small as a doll in a doll's house. A feeling of tenderness filled my heart. My heroine would be myself, only in disguise. She would be called Elaine. Elaine. I counted the letters on my fingers. There were 6 letters in Esther, too. It seemed a lucky thing. Elaine sat on the breezeway in an old yellow nightgown of her mother's waiting for something to happen. It was a sweltering morning in July, and drops of sweat crawled down her back one by one, like slow insects. I leaned back and read what I had written. It seemed lively enough, and I was quite proud of the bit about the drops of sweat like insects, only I had the dim impression I'd probably read it somewhere else a long time ago. I sat like that for about an hour, trying to think what would come next, and in my mind, the barefoot doll in her mother's old yellow nightgown sat and stared into space as well. "Why, honey, don't you want to get dressed?" My mother took care never to tell me to do anything. She would only reason with me sweetly, like one intelligent mature person with another. "It's almost 3 in the afternoon. I'm writing a novel," I said. "I haven't got time to change out of this and change into that." I lay on the couch on the breezeway and shut my eyes. I could hear my mother clearing the typewriter and the papers from the card table and laying out the silver for supper, but I didn't move. Inertia oozed like molasses through Elaine's limbs. That's what it must feel like to have malaria, she thought. At any rate, I'd be lucky if I wrote a page a day. Then I knew what the trouble was. I needed experience. How could I write about life when I'd never had a love affair or a baby? Or even seen anybody die? A girl I knew had just won a prize for a short story about her adventures among the pygmies in Africa. How could I compete with that sort of thing? By the end of supper my mother had convinced me I should study shorthand in the evenings. Then I would be killing 2 birds with one stone, writing a novel and learning something practical as well. I would also be saving a whole lot of money. That same evening, my mother unearthed an old blackboard from the cellar and set it up on the breezeway. Then she stood at the blackboard and scribbled little curlicues in white chalk while I sat in a chair and watched. At first I felt hopeful. I thought I might learn shorthand in no time, and when the freckled lady in the scholarships office asked me why I hadn't worked to earn money in July and August, the way you were supposed to if you were a scholarship girl, I could tell her I had taken a free shorthand course instead, so I could support myself right after college. The only thing was, when I tried to picture myself in some job, briskly jotting down line after line of shorthand, my mind went blank. There wasn't one job I felt like doing where you used shorthand. And, as I sat there and watched, the white chalk curlicues blurred into senselessness. I told my mother I had a terrible headache, and went to bed. An hour later the door inched open, and she crept into the room. I heard the whisper of her clothes as she undressed. She climbed into bed. Then her breathing grew slow and regular. In the dim light of the street lamp that filtered through the drawn blinds, I could see the pin curls on her head glittering like a row of little bayonets. I decided I would put off the novel until I had gone to Europe and had a lover, and that I would never learn a word of shorthand. If I never learned shorthand I would never have to use it. I thought I would spend the summer reading Finnegan's Wake and writing my thesis. Then I would be way ahead when college started at the end of September, and able to enjoy my last year instead of swatting away with no makeup and stringy hair, on a diet of coffee and Benzedrine, the way most of the seniors taking honors did, until they finished their thesis. Then I thought I might put off college for a year and apprentice myself to a pottery maker. Or work my way to Germany and be a waitress, until I was bilingual. Then plan after plan started leaping through my head, like a family of scatty rabbits. I saw the years of my life spaced along a road in the form of telephone poles, threaded together by wires. I counted 1, 2, 3, 19 telephone poles, and then the wires dangled into space, and try as I would, I couldn't see a single pole beyond the 19th. The room blued into view, and I wondered where the night had gone. My mother turned from a foggy log into a slumbering, middle-aged woman, her mouth slightly open and a snore raveling from her throat. The piggish noise irritated me, and for a while it seemed to me that the only way to stop it would be to take the column of skin and sinew from which it rose and twist it to silence between my hands. I feigned sleep until my mother left for school, but even my eyelids didn't shut out the light. They hung the raw, red screen of their tiny vessels in front of me like a wound. I crawled between the mattress and the padded bedstead and let the mattress fall across me like a tombstone. It felt dark and safe under there, but the mattress was not heavy enough. It needed about a ton more weight to make me sleep. River Run, past Eve and Adams, from swerve of shore to bend of bay, brings us by a commodious ficus of recirculation back to Howth Castle and environs. The thick book made an unpleasant dent in my stomach. River Run, past Eve and Adams. I thought the small letter at the start might mean that nothing ever really began all new, with a capital, but that it just flowed on from what came before. Eve and Adams was Adam and Eve, or course, but it probably signified something else as well. Maybe it was a pub in Dublin. My eyes sank through an alphabet soup of letters to the long word in the middle of the page. Bababed Algeric te Kamaran kan Brontenerenchen Thuntravar. How nonskantu Hurden Thurnek. I counted the letters. There were exactly 100 of them. I thought this must be important. Why should there be 100 letters? Haltingly, I tried the word aloud. It sounded like a heavy wooden object falling downstairs, bump bump. Bump, step after step. Lifting the pages of the book, I let them fan slowly by my eyes. Words, dimly familiar but twisted all awry, like faces in a funhouse mirror, fled past, leaving no impression on the glassy surface of my brain. I squinted at the page. The letters grew barbs and ram's horns. I watched them separate, each from the other, and jiggle up and down in a silly way. Then they associated themselves in fantastic, untranslatable shapes, like Arabic or Chinese. I decided to junk my thesis. I decided to junk the whole honors program and become an ordinary English major. I went to look up the requirements of an ordinary English major at my college. There were lots of requirements, and I didn't have half of them. One of the requirements was a course in the 18th century. I hated the very idea of the 18th century, with all those smug men writing tight little